Rouhani's re-election was neither preordained nor was it easy. We see that President Trump has not laid out any concrete proposals or specifics on how to counter the Iranian actions in the region. For the Iranians, the regime survival usually trumps ideology.
Hello, this is Paul Salem with the Vantage Point at the Middle East Institute. I'm very pleased and happy to have with me my colleague Ahmad Majidyar. Mr. Majidyar is a fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he's the director of our IranObserved Project, which is a project that Ahmad will tell us more about during this session. Mr. Majidyar, before joining the Middle East Institute, was a senior research associate at the American Enterprise Institute, where he wrote a number of monographs on Iran, Iran's role in the region, as well as writings on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's lectured and gave briefings at the Naval Postgraduate School, the National Defense University, the State Department, and Congress. And he is fluent in Farsi, Pashto, and Urdu. And Ahmad, we're very pleased to have you with us today. Let's start with the Iranian elections. How do you explain the results? And what impact do you think they will have on Iran's foreign and regional policy?
The Iranian election was a referendum on President Rouhani's message of carrying out social, economic, and political reforms and promoting the Iranians' civil liberties and individual freedoms, versus a more populist message of his conservative rival, Ebrahim Raisi, who was advocating more to looking inwards to address Iran's economic problems. And obviously, the majority of Iranians embraced the incumbent's message and secured him a second term in office. But despite the conventional wisdom, the Rouhani's re-election was neither preordained nor was it easy, because he was facing a very formidable challenge from Ebrahim Raisi, who had the backing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the powerful Revolutionary Guards, the judiciary, and also most of the conservative political factions in the country. And in addition to that, most of Rouhani's reformist base, they were not very happy with the track record of the president over the past 4 years. First, because they were saying that the president had not stood up to the judiciary, to the Revolutionary Guards.
That's a question. I mean, President Rouhani, when he ran 4 years ago, did not run as a reformist. He ran as sort of a pragmatist, or a moderate, maybe was the term that was used. And even maybe at the beginning of his campaign here, he didn't, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of present himself that way. But as the campaign got going, he seemed to be talking more like a reformist, or getting the votes of reformists who had nobody else to vote for. Is it accurate to say that President Rouhani has shifted a bit?
No, actually, he played the same game in this election, because first he presented himself as the pragmatist, what President Rouhani really is, because he is one of the clerics who emerged after the '97 revolution and is part of that generation. So he has already always tried to build bridges between the conservative and reformists, and the same way between the Iranian state and the outside world. But because many of the reformists were not very happy in the past 4 years, it was also because of the economic reasons that they did not reap the benefits of the nuclear agreement the way they expected. So the Rouhani camp feared that perhaps most of the reformist base would just stay home and they would not come to vote. As a result, in the last days of the election, that we saw that Rouhani became an outsider candidate, an anti-establishment candidate. And he also touched on some very red lines of the regime. He very strongly criticized the Revolutionary Guards, the judiciary, even touched on Iran's regional actions, which is a taboo subject. So that policy or that strategy,
galvanized
to galvanize the disillusioned reformist base. So
Well,
that definitely secured him the second re-election, but he could face backlash from the conservatives now that he has made those.
Well, let's ask about what it matters. First, a little bit domestically. I mean, obviously, in his first election campaign and presidency, he banked a lot on, we'll get a nuclear deal and then sanctions would be lifted and the economy would improve. Obviously, now in his second term, faced with an administration in the U.S. which is not likely to, go down the road President Obama did, but also the reality that much of Iran's economic problems are domestic. Other than lifting sanctions, there's reforms. The IRGC is very controlling of it's a very corrupted and controlled economy. Can he impact how the economy is run and structured inside Iran? And secondly, can he impact those social issues, the issues of more freedom and so on, which are also tightly controlled by I don't know if it's a supreme leader, but the institutions of government. In other words, aside from the issue of does he have influence in foreign policy, how much influence does he have in real domestic change?
Sure. What we learned during the past 4 years of Rouhani's presidency, that he has learned from his predecessors, both from 2 terms of the Ahmadinejad government and also especially from Mohammad Khatami, who was the agent of reform and change in Iran and was elected on that platform back in 1997, and he was president until Ahmadinejad came to the presidency in 2005. So he learned from them that when they wanted to challenge the supreme leader, they wanted to challenge the IRGC, and they wanted to implement radical reforms, they failed because the deep state rose against it. So that's why we saw that he wants to implement certain reforms, but in a very gradual manner, not to antagonize those institutions.
And you think he will have some success?
I think that he did have some success over the past years. And one of the successes, we talk about the presidential election, which is of course important. What is less talked about in the Western media is that the reformists also did very well in the city and village council elections. And Tehran has been challenger. Khalibaf may not be the mayor of Tehran because all the seats of Tehran went to the reformists. So during the past 4 years, he created some space for the civil society, for the student unions, from the labor unions, and other segments of the society, that they found some kind of atmosphere to just operate in. And that mobilized them, and they became a force in these elections.
Well, let's move a bit to foreign policy.
Sure.
And talk first about relations with the West, and then maybe more extensively about Iran, the IRGC, particularly its interventions in Syria and in other places, and how that might not be affected or might be affected by the presidential election. But starting with the West, maybe Europe and the US. Obviously, the Trump administration is very different than the Obama one. President Trump just visited Saudi Arabia and had very strong statements right after the election. How is that being received in Iran? How is President Rouhani or others looking to the future of their relations with the US and Europe?
When I was monitoring the Iranian media during the campaign season, the US election campaign season here, I noticed that they were very cautiously optimistic about President Trump because he saw him as a deal maker, as a businessman, and also because President Trump openly said that he had a favorable view of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. So they thought that that would perhaps benefit Iran's policies in Syria and the broader region. But that optimism quickly faded away after President Trump took office in January. He included Iran in a travel ban. He imposed new sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile program. He also put Iran on notice and also reinvigorated its ties with Washington's traditional allies to push back against Iranians' actions, as we noticed in recent Trump's visit to Riyadh and Israel. So they're not optimistic about that, but at the same time, we see that President Trump has not laid out any concrete proposals or specifics on how to counter the Iranian actions in the region. So there is confusion in Tehran.
They're still waiting.
Indeed, President Rouhani, on Monday, during his first press conference after winning re-election, he was asked that question by a journalist, and his reply was that we will wait until that there is some, I'm quoting him, continuity and stability in the U.S. policies so we can judge better what the Trump administration's policy for the region is.
Let me ask you, I mean, you were saying how the Iranians were following the U.S. election.
Yes.
In the Iranian election campaigns and season and so on itself, was there any debate inside Iran? Because clearly the IRGC seems to have its own policy in the Middle East and intervention and sending militia members and so on, which doesn't seem necessarily to be, reflected or necessarily supported by other sectors in the society. Does that tension in Iran's, policies in the Middle East come out inside Iran? Do people debate it? Do people complain that Iran is paying a price for these actions?
There was actually a very vigorous debate about that, and that was perhaps the most interesting debate in the Iranian elections in terms of the IRGC's role in the broader Middle East region and also the Tehran's engagement with the West. In terms of the engagement with the West, both candidates used the nuclear agreement, but in different ways. Rouhani's message was that at this time that we have a very tough Trump presidency that is threatening war and more sanctions, we need somebody moderate in office to diffuse that tension and work with the United States. But on the other hand, Raisi, his conservative rival, was saying that no, the U.S. gave Rouhani a check, but he cannot cash it. That's his words. So you need somebody strong to stand up to the U.S. and get the Iranians' rights, especially those sanctions relief. So that was a debate. And when it
but on the debate on the IRGC, what it does, I mean, Trump administration, but what the Iran's IRGC itself is doing, what's the debate there? People
that was also part of the campaign, although President Rouhani didn't mention about that because that is a taboo subject that would put him on a collision course with the IRGC. He didn't question Iran, he indeed defended Iran's IRGC's role in Syria, in Iraq, and the broader Middle East. He defended that. But we saw from the voters at different campaign rallies where Rouhani was not present, but some of reformist leaders were holding those rallies, that they were talking very openly about IRGC's military adventurism in the Middle East and involvement in conflicts at the expense of domestic priorities at home. And usually those kind of messages got the biggest round of applause amongst the Iranians.
Interesting.
So that definitely has worried the IRGC and perhaps even Khamenei, because most of the Iranians now do not support the IRGC's role in regional conflict. Although the IRGC is trying to portray its role as saying that we have to fight them there in order to maintain Iran as an island of stability in a very, very tense region, but the Iranians are not buying that.
Interesting. Tell us a bit about the project, the IranObserved Project, before we get into a discussion about the IRGC's sort of vision for the Middle East.
Sure.
What's the project?
We created the IranObserved Project at the Middle East Institute 6 months ago in order to provide daily tracking and analysis of those actions and policies of the Iranian state actors and also its various arms in the region that negatively affect Iran's neighbors as well as the broader international community. And we rely primarily on the open source information from the Iranian media and press published inside Iran in Farsi to help policymakers and practitioners as well as anyone interested in Iran, journalists, people from the academia, public policy organizations, to understand and identify Iran's soft power and hard power strategies, those political and military leaders that shape and implement those policies, and also Iran's various support
and anybody, I mean,
network
it's on our website, anybody can gain access to it. There's also a weekly newsletter and a daily newsletter if people want to get into your inbox to get these updates.
Absolutely, yeah. We send this daily newsletters and also more broader weekly newsletters. And anybody interested in Iran and especially in Iran's activities in the region and the broader Middle East region can sign up to those newsletters to receive them in their mail.
Good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Iran in the Middle East, largely. A couple of questions. I mean, maybe the main question I'll start with is that Is this, in a sense, purely an IRGC? In other words, when we talk about Iran's sort of activities in the Middle East, maybe the oldest one is their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, because that goes back to the 1980s. But now you have tens of thousands of militia fighters in Syria. You have some of the popular mobilization units in Iraq and support for the Houthis in Yemen. So it's a much broader thing now. First of all, does all of that go to the IRGC, the Quds forces, Qasem Soleimani, or are other institutions in Iran involved as well?
No, there are different centers of power inside Iran that shape Iran's foreign policy, and the government definitely plays a part in it. The Office of Supreme Leader, through its advisors and also representatives to different centers of power, including the IRGC, supervises those policies and can veto any power, and sometimes can recommend things or just impose things on IRGC or on the government too. But when it comes to the conflicts on Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and to some extent Lebanon too, it is mostly just the IRGC which devises and implements those strategies, because the governments change in Iran, but they are always just on the ground. And these actors are not answerable to the elected government in Iran. They are only answerable to Khamenei, and they answer to him. Although on paper they should be responsible.
Let me ask a second question. In their view, IRGC or even the Supreme Leader, what is the vision? What's the project? I mean, is it hegemonic? Is it purely defensive? Is it sectarian, Shiite, Islamist, jihadist kind of thing? Or is it a combination of all of those? What is their vision of what they're doing?
Yeah, I was just about to say that it is a combination of all of that, because after the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Republic's founder, Imam Khomeini, wanted to spread and export the revolution abroad, and he was very open about that. He was not even talking about the Shia world. He wanted to be the leader of the Islamic world. But then soon he tasted some humility, because he saw the limits of his revolution, because the Shiites makes only about perhaps 20% of the Muslim population. The other 80 or about 80% they are Sunnis. So they did not side, of course, with Iran. And even in the Shiite areas, but this is a misconception, especially in the West, that the Shiite community, it's a monolithic group, it's a fifth column of Iran. That is not true, because they are very diverse in terms of their identity, in terms of their nationality, in terms of their domestic politics. And some of them, even if they have some religious ties to the holy centers in Qom, that does not translate to political allegiance. So they do not follow Iran. So that was the reason that, especially after the Iraq war, that the Iraqi Shia sided with Saddam against Iran. So they understood the limits of the revolution. But for now they don't have that idea, but they want to expand their sphere of influence across the region, primarily in the Arab world.
And is that, I mean, to end with that, but that's a big statement. They want to spread their influence in the Middle East. Where does that end in their view? Is that something that wherever they have an opportunity, they will take it? Does it have a long-term goal? Or is it reactive? You know, Assad was in trouble, so they help him out a bit. ISIS appears in western Iraq, so they help out the PMU. Is it reactive, or is it, in their view, part of an ongoing revolution and spread?
From the discussions that I see from the Iranian media, how the Iranian leaders talk about it, you see that their immediate concern is their immediate neighborhood. They intervene in Syria because Syria is their strategic allies. They see Syria as strategically also important to use it as a corridor to help Hezbollah and other militia groups across the region. They intervened against the U.S. presence in Iraq because a Shiite majority Iraq is in their benefit. They have deepened ties with the Taliban in Afghanistan because they want to accelerate the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region, although Taliban is ideologically opposed to the Islamic Republic. So they want to create that sphere of influence in their immediate region, that first of all, that there is no American military presence, so that does not threaten them. Secondly, in a kind of rivalry with regional Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia. And in terms of its influence or revolutionary ideas into the rest of the world, that usually comes second. For the Iranians, the regime survival usually trumps ideology. And Khomeini has showed it, and during the Iran-Iraq war that it stopped it. Imam Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, they show it in terms of going against that red line and dealing with the United States when the regime survival was in doubt. So always, it is about their survival, regime survival, first, and then comes ideology and interest.
Well, let's end with one of the key battlegrounds, Syria. And there's been a lot happening there. And you wrote an article a few days ago before the U.S. struck some militia groups that were approaching a position in the south, those groups backed by Iran, and it was a big development. How do you see, and you just said that Iran wants the U.S. out of the region, yet the U.S. is becoming more present, certainly in sort of eastern Syria and indirectly with Jordan and some southern parts of Syria, and Iran, Hezbollah becoming increasingly alarmed about that. How do you see that developing?
No, you're absolutely right about it, because reading the commentaries and reports, especially in those media outlets affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards, you see a growing concern in Tehran that the Trump administration is increasing its military presence and involvement in Iraq and Syria. So they're already seeing post-ISIS region. Now ISIS is not that big threat that Iran was seeing to its influence in the region. In Iraq, for example, those militia forces that Iran is supporting, you already see that they have turned their attention from the ISIS more towards their regional rivals, as well as the US military presence there. They are trying to pressure the Baghdad government to expel the military advisor from Western Mosul. In Syria as well, now that the Assad regime is in control of the key population centers, now the biggest worry for the Iranians, according to the IRGC outlets, is the military buildup of the US in northern Jordanian border and the training of opposition forces, because they see it as a broader plan to reverse some of the gains of the Assad regime and the Iranians. So in general, we can say that now that the Islamic State is on the brink of defeat in Iraq, and also it is losing ground in Syria, we will see more tension and more confrontation between the Iranian-led forces and the US military and its allies in the region.
Very interesting. Ahmed, thank you very, very much for this interview, for this discussion. Please visit the website, IranObserved. It's at the Middle East Institute website. Thank you for being with us. This has been Vantage Point from the Middle East Institute.